My name is Jonathan Stewart, and I'm a member of the Shenandoah Group of the Sierra Club Executive Committee. On behalf of the Shenandoah Group of the Sierra Club and Climate Action Alliance of the Valley, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for our discussion. If you're interested in connecting with our local Sierra Club group or looking for ways to get more involved in general, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via email at sc.shen.group@gmail.com. You can also get connected with us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/sc.shen.group. And you can connect to Climate Action Alliance of the Valley at climateactionallianceofthevalley.org. We're excited to welcome back Connor Kish and Bob Shippee. Connor and Bob joined us in January to talk us through what to expect from the Virginia legislative session, and they are back this evening to provide an update. Connor serves as the Sierra Club Virginia chapter's legislative and political director. He is a veteran of many successful political campaigns and of the Virginia General Assembly. He served Delegate Betsy Carr as her legislative aide in the House of Delegates for 3 years and later assisted House Majority Co-Whip Delegate Mike Mullen. In 2018, he was campaign manager for Congressman Donald McEachin's successful bid for a second term in Congress. Most recently, he managed Henrico County Commonwealth's Attorney Shannon Taylor's successful re-election and later served as an advisor. Connor graduated from Rudolph-Macon College with a BA in political science and communication studies and lives in Richmond. Bob has a bachelor's degree from Syracuse University and a master's degree from Cornell University. He worked in financial services for 28 years for a predecessor of Bank of America and for Capital One. Bob ran for county office in 2015, which led him to become an active person in the political arena. He has been a member of the Sierra Club for many years, served as chapter treasurer from 2007 to 2010, and for the past several years has led the legislative and political committees. He volunteers full-time as an environmental advocate during General Assembly sessions. He also served as treasurer of the Henrico Democratic Committee and is vice chair of the Henrico Electoral Board. Bob lives in Western Henrico County with his wife and youngest daughter, and also has 4 adult children. Connor and Bob, thank you again for coming back and providing us an update on this important topic, and the call is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. It's always fun for Bob and I to have our bios read out loud. Reminder of all the things that we've done. So we want to just spend some time with you this afternoon, this evening, I guess, to talk about the General Assembly session that has just occurred and is a little bit still ongoing. And we'll share some updates on some of the bills we worked on, some of the issues we faced, and some thoughts on where we are headed from here legislatively. So the first thing that I wanted to do is discuss a little bit about the situation on the ground, sort of what it looked like for Bob and I when we were there in the building, in the Capitol building. There was a lot of tension this year. It existed in a variety of different ways, which you can see on the screen, but obviously tension between political parties, tension between the leadership in both chambers, because the House of Delegates is controlled by the Republican Party and the state Senate is controlled by the Democratic Party. So obviously there are some tensions between the heavyweights, if you will, in both parties. There's tension, still is tension, between the members of the House and members of the Senate that write the budget, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. And after a gubernatorial election year, obviously we got a new governor in Glenn Youngkin, and there was tension between the governor and state Senate over the governor's appointments, over the governor's cabinet selections, and his appointments to boards and commissions, which got very heated. And we'll also touch on that. And obviously things people said on the campaign trail and they try and make their promises good when they get there are not aligned on both sides of the aisle, and you have 2 sets of people trying to accomplish different things. So it sets the stage for a pretty tense environment that we walked into. Bob, any thoughts on our political tension?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of tension when we were with you earlier this year. We probably predicted some of these points of tension, and indeed it came true. So a lot of the theme that you'll get from tonight's talk, I suspect, is going to have echoes of our earlier conversation with you, because it really, a lot of it did sort of go true to form, although there were some surprises along the way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about one of those surprises. And that was the nomination of the former Trump administration EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler to serve as Virginia's Secretary of Natural and Historical Resources, if you can believe that. And so this nomination, was met by a couple of things. It was met by severe resistance in the state Senate from Democratic legislators. It was met with an absolutely united front of opposition from environmental organizations. And it was met with opposition from business organizations. And it was met even with opposition from people that didn't want to tell you that they were having opposition to it, but they would rather just stay quiet and not do anything, but would share with us personally either a look or a side eye or some other sort of indication that they were concerned by this nomination and generally opposed it. But thanks to a number of things, and the first one that I want to mention particularly for folks members of the Shenandoah group is the level of advocacy that occurred from our members across the Commonwealth on this issue. When I say thousands, I mean thousands of different people took action and wrote their legislators in opposition to Andrew Wheeler through one of the action alerts that we sent out along the way. And it makes a difference. And Bob always says that, it only takes 5, 10, 15 emails for a legislator to go, and start to get their attention because they can ignore a 1 off, but they can't ignore a 15 off. And they start to get concerned and then they realize it's time to pay attention. And that definitely happened in this case with Andrew Wheeler. And like I mentioned, the strength of the environmental community, there were no environmental organizations in Virginia that were not in opposition to this nomination, and our own lobbying capacity. So the work that we are able to fund through contributions to the Sierra Club, Bob and I went in there and personally lobbied legislators against Andrew Wheeler, and got as many commitments as we could to lead to his nomination being rejected. And you'll see on the screen this sort of black box, the 21 green names. It's a little bit backwards here. So the 21 green names are voting to defeat the nomination, even though they're voting yes. And the red 19 are voting to confirm the nomination, even though they're voting no. So you see the 21 Democratic names lit up in green and the 19 Republican names lit up in red. So it's a party line vote, and his nomination was defeated in early March. And when the General Assembly adjourned on March 12th, he was forced to leave office. So he is no longer the Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources. And that was a really big victory. And it took a lot of time and effort, as Bob, I'm sure will tell you here in just a second. But we're really proud of this effort because we think it shows the best of what our organization is capable of. When we gather all people power together, we can make a difference. So, Bob, any thoughts on Mr. Wheeler's nomination?
Yeah, I mean, you told the saga quite well. I just want to highlight for folks that are listening to this that you look at that vote tally and you say, oh, party line vote. Well, that kind of figures. Well, in this case, and in a couple of other cases we'll talk about in a few moments, that Democratic majority in the Senate is not guaranteed to give us a full 21 votes on every issue. And this is one where we had to fight tooth and nail with a couple of senators that were really waffling. And again, you'll hear us say it over and over again tonight that you can't even lose one vote from that 21-member Democratic caucus in the Senate because ties are broken by the Republican lieutenant governor. So we just never were comfortable on anything all session long because we couldn't lose a single vote in the Senate. So I just wanted to bring that up on this. And again, we'll return to that theme later.
Yeah, absolutely. A tenuous majority at best on good days. I joked with Bob on another call that we were pretty close to just actually counting the number of people sitting in their seats on the Senate floor and counting the votes one by one on this one, just to make sure we had everything in place. So when you think of things that Bob and I are doing, just think of us up in the gallery going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, to make sure we have enough things and people and things in place to make sure that our priorities are getting where they need to go. I'm going to pass it over to Bob to touch a little bit on some of the things that we succeeded on this year. And if you were listening to the earlier presentation that we gave earlier this year, we set out with a goal to do this, which we feel we've largely accomplished.
Right. We definitely knew that the accomplishments of the past 2 years were going to come under fire, and they did. One of the things that Connor and I did in December mostly, but several weeks leading up to session, was to meet with as many of the Senate Democrats as we could for the reasons that we just talked about. We knew that that had to be our firewall against every attack. The Clean Economy Act, there were several bills, and I've got a list here. I'm not going to count them, but it was 6 to 8 bills that attacked the Clean Economy Act in different ways. A couple of them were straight repeals, and we were always pretty confident that the Senate was not going to allow those. They of course, all of these bills passed the House, but we were pretty confident that the radical, repeal bills were not going to pass the Senate, and indeed they got no traction. But there were more subtle attacks around, how we get our renewable energy, or, in a later point here, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, letting one particular polluter not pay the full price of their pollution allowances. I mean, these were sort of more subtle attacks that did get a little bit of traction, and we had to fight to stave off. But in the end, all of these things survive. The clean car standards, only a couple of attacks there. But again, we couldn't be comfortable until we got the vote, in that case, in the Senate Agriculture Committee, which is only 8 to 7 Democrats. So again, cannot lose a single vote. And so really, I would say 80% of our time for Connor and me was defending these and fighting against the Wheeler nomination you saw on the previous page. It doesn't sound like an exciting way to spend your days, but it was so important. And I do think the reason why we put these up front in this presentation is that when we look back on 2022 session in future years, these are the things that we'll remember.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only 5 bullet points, but it was probably 500 hours of combined work to make sure that all this showed up on the slide the way that it did. I want to touch on 2 things that, for lack of a better word, that we keep doing this presentation and not coming up with a better word to describe it, but offensive priorities, things we were trying to get done, not just defend. And the first one I'm going to talk about didn't pass, but the second one I'm going to talk about did pass. And they're both very interesting. We had a bill that Sierra Club brought, that Senator Favola sponsored for us, that would have required that whenever a state government or local government goes to construct a new building of any kind, so we're thinking schools, firehouses, courthouses, anything that a local government or state government might build, that when the building was done, it needed to have a solar ready roof. So it didn't need to have solar panels on it, but it needed to have the right connections and the right wiring and the right placement and all of those things to make solar successful, because thanks to some of the laws that Bob has worked on passing over the last couple of years, schools have the opportunities to be involved in power purchase agreements, or PPAs. Which means they enter into an agreement with a utility. They put solar panels on the roof of their buildings and start drastically saving on the cost of their energy for those buildings. And unfortunately, while we thought this was a really great idea, there were a lot of legislators that basically set out this session to defeat anything that they viewed as a mandate from the government, particularly in the House of Delegates. They simply weren't voting, not just on our issues, but on a host of others. They weren't voting to mandate things. And so we're going to work over the next several months. Bob and I are going to sit down and work with some folks to see if we can come up with a different approach to this. because the bottom line is, if you're a local government, you're about to, you could, if you do this, you save hundreds of thousands of dollars over the life of a school. You know, think of how old some of the school buildings that we're using today are. If you're building a school today, it'll probably be in use in about 100 years still. And that's about 100 years worth of energy costs. So we're trying to make this make sense at the General Assembly. Unfortunately, we just didn't have it right this year. But switching gears to something that we did have right this year, which was our vehicle fleet optimization bill, which was Senate Bill 575 from Senator Monty Mason. We set out earlier in 2021 to figure out a way to transition the state government's car fleet to electric vehicles. The Commonwealth of Virginia owns about 100,000 cars that are used for a variety of different purposes, and they have a life cycle. Every 15 to 20 years they roll off and the state has to purchase a new car. Well, knowing that we were going to have not a lot of success mandating the purchase of electric cars, we went about it a little bit of a different way. So currently, what happens is when it's time for the state to buy a new car for its fleet, they go on the website, they find the cheapest car, they go, hooray, we found the cheapest car, they buy it. What we did is change the law to say that when the state government goes to buy a new car, they no longer consider just the initial purchase price of the car. They now consider the total cost of ownership over the life cycle of the state's ownership of the car. So that means that the state procurement offices, the offices that buy these cars, are now going to have to consider how much fuel are they going to use over 15 years, how much oil, how much maintenance, how many oil changes, all of those things into the cost of the car, not just the initial purchase price. And this is not a mandate on electric cars. It does not say it has to be an electric car, but what it will be is an electric car, because there is no way that the state will find a combustion engine car that's going to be cheaper over 15 to 20 years of maintenance and gas when it comes to an electric car. So we've accomplished our goal, because starting on July 1st of 2023, which is the next, when the law goes into effect in the next car cycle for the state, there's going to be a huge infusion of electric cars into the state fleet because of this little wording change that we've done to the law. So this is our example of just how creative Bob and I and the larger environmental coalition had to get this year to accomplish some goals. I mean, we know 40% of emissions in Virginia come from tailpipes in cars in the transportation sector. And if we want to take a big swing at that, we got to get really creative. And so this is about a 100,000 car swing at it that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have this sort of creative, calculative way of balancing the economics of it. Bob, anything you want to add on these two?
Yeah, so I just say two things. On the solar roof bill, Connor's exactly right. The only explanation for that bill failing is that Republicans decided they were just going to defeat Democratic bills, because there have been Republican senators in the past who have put forward and passed bills that are not that dissimilar to that. So that was strictly a partisan issue, and it's sad because it hurts no one and would help Virginians across the spectrum. You know, the vehicle fleet optimization, it has got to be my favorite bill from this session. You know, even though I said in the previous slides, when folks write the book of the 2022 session, they'll remember the Wheeler nomination and the defense of the major accomplishments from the past couple of years. That is true. What I will remember from this session is this bill, because it was very craftily written. I cannot believe it passed unanimously. Nothing passes unanimously. And so I take no credit for that. Connor worked on this one, and others in our coalition worked this. It was not obviously going to pass at the beginning. In fact, we were actually kind of worried because people were asking questions. We weren't sure we even had the votes in committee. But and I'll give Mason some credit here. We'll take some credit away later, but he did a very good job on this. And I think this is the most meaningful bill that passed this session. It is going to result in steady, if not rapid, as we say here, electrification of the state's fleet. And I hope that it will be replicated throughout local, county and local levels as well. I can't remember, Connor, if there was a piece of this bill that referenced anything below the state level, but even if not, I hope that when other jurisdictions see this, they will raise their eyebrows and say, this maybe is something that we could do, because it does not violate any of the negative buzzwords that we'll talk about in a few minutes that Republicans always vote against: mandates, fees, whatever. It is just, hey, just calculate it more correctly and you'll get the right answer. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the main selling point here. This was an economics driven bill. It makes sense with taxpayer money. And that argument won the day. And after a year, Bob, to get to your point, after a year of having this program in operation, the state government is required to share the program with local governments. And then the local governments can take action as they will. But it does put the onus on the state to sort of start giving out this information and the way of doing this to the local governments. So on this slide, there's a lot of words, but I want to also touch on this a lot because there's a couple of different themes in here of continued work that's not just stopped, but is still going, still moving forward. The first two bills at the top deal with a concept that, well, Bob and I thought was pretty simple. Did not have the same reaction at the General Assembly, but it deals with comprehensive planning for locality. So every locality, no matter how small, has a comprehensive plan where they sort of plan their future, right? They say, we think we're going to build more houses here, we're going to put a Walmart, we're going to put another road, we're going to do something. And it sort of lays out the future of the locality. And these two bills would have, in different ways, incorporated climate resilience as a factor in the locality's climate or in the locality's comprehensive plan. They would have to consider climate change and climate resilience. And in the case of the first bill listed, they would have to have a healthy community strategy, meaning that for all economic development that could have a negative environmental impact, with increased air pollution, increased water pollution, or increased water discharges, generally speaking, they'd have to have a plan to address that in their comprehensive plan. And that plan could be, we're not going to have that, or that plan could be, we're going to have a great mitigation plan for it, and we're going to have some of it, or it could be, we're going to have all of it. But even those two bills were not able to get through the House of Delegates, and it's kind of a shame because Bob has a lot of experience at the local level, but you'd think that these folks would be inclined to do these things, but again, we ran into a little bit of a wall there. Bob?
Yeah, and we'll go through this list pretty quickly, but one thing I'll suggest to you is that there is a pattern. So when you look at the House bills sponsored by Democrats, which is the top couple and the bottom three, you'll see they all fail. The reason for that is what we've talked about. There were decisions made within the party caucus, the Republican Party caucus, that they were just going to knock these down. The middle bills that we're about to talk about, those passed. Three of those four they're still sponsored by Democrats, but three of those four had a Senate patron, and between the two patrons, they were able to get enough bipartisan support to get these through committee. That is a lesson that I think Connor and I take away from this session for next year, because it's a very clear pattern, right? So if we have some bills that are like this in the 2023 session, I think part of the secret sauce will have to be, can you find a patron in the other chamber that can help carry the water?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of those bills that did meet success was from Senator Marsden and Delegate Tran, which established the Wildlife Corridor Grant Fund. And this created a fund in the state government that could accept not only taxpayer dollars, but philanthropic dollars or individual dollars if someone was so inclined, to establish wildlife corridors, which exists for the sole purpose of reducing wildlife and vehicle collisions on major roads across Virginia. Had a lot of success in other states. Utah and Idaho Colorado have had a lot of success with programs like this, and this is an attempt to get the ball rolling on that. The next bill is the Transit Ridership Incentive Program. One of the, I hesitate to call it a benefit, but one of the benefits of COVID is that we realized that people who utilize transit as their main main purpose for transportation were having vastly better experiences during COVID because the transit programs were free for a good long while there, while everything was suspended. And the people were typically paying, you know, from $1 to $5 or whatever it may be to ride the bus or ride the train. And what we realized is that that's a really bad way of doing things, and that we could actually increase transit ridership and thus decrease pollution because there would be less cars on the road if we simply made the bus and trains free to ride and paid for their maintenance and other, you know, associated services with tax money. Essentially, it is an effort to not make every bus and train ride a toll, which is what is happening, you know, up until COVID started. You think about how few toll roads there are in Virginia. You know, you think of the major ones up Northern Virginia and down in Hampton roads, the bridge tunnels and things like that. But your average road that you pull out of your neighborhood and go down the street on is not a toll road. And so it was an effort to equalize transit ridership and say that the way we're funding it was, one, not working, and two, ineffective. So this is a really exciting bill that hopefully is going to really help us sustain free transit, or at least decreased fee transit in Virginia for the next several years. The next bill is the Virginia Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Historic Preservation Fund. The Commonwealth of Virginia funds programs for a number of different purposes that acquire and protect land that's of historic value. The most common one that people hear about is battlefields. So several state battlefields are protected, or at least ones that are not under federal jurisdiction. But no fund existed to protect land of cultural value or land of importance to Indigenous peoples or people of color. And so this bill corrects that, and we now have a fund to allow for the purchase of land to go into easements, protection easements for land that's culturally significant. And then the next bill deals with the replacement and conservation of trees during development. It is very long and very hard to explain, but essentially what I learned the other day is the bottom line is when there is a development occurring of any kind, so commercial or residential, there will now be more trees left in the end. That is the best way to describe it, along with all the somehow dozens and dozens of pages of legislation that took. And the next bill, this is a personal favorite of mine, which finally tried to get at the absolutely disastrous plastic pollution problem that we have all across the country by saying that it was time for the producers of plastic to actually pay something for the damage they're causing and actually pay to fund recycling programs. So right now, most recycling programs are funded by the locality, which means they're funded by you, the taxpayer. And so this bill was to say, we need to change this up a little bit. You guys are increasing production of plastic and decreasing the amount of money you put into dealing with the problem. This bill was honestly kind of a funny scene in committee. It was me there supporting it and maybe two other folks. And basically any industry lobbyist that Bob and I could have plucked off the street had lined up, about 15 of them, to oppose this bill, representing any company you can think of, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, the Manufacturing Association, everybody, because they don't want to pay it. they like that the taxpayer pays it. So this was a statement bill we were making. We were telling these people that this issue is not going away and that we're going to keep coming after it, even though it failed. It did make them work. And then the last two deal with water quality. The first bill would have studied the occurrence of various PFAS and other chemicals in water. And for some reason that that didn't pass. And the second bill deals with water quality and baseline conditions. So one of the things that we hear from our members is that they often go and say to DEQ when they're considering permits for anything really, does this project in the end keep the water quality the same? Does it improve the water quality, or does it worsen the water quality? And the answer that we always get back from DEQ is, well, we don't know, because we don't know what the current water quality is at that particular spot that you're asking us about. So this was another creative idea, I thought, where we would require the permit applicant, so the person trying to get the permit from DEQ, to actually provide the baseline water quality from a third party. They'd have to go out and do it and bring it to DEQ as part of their application. So we could say, 10 years from now, the water quality is X, but back when you applied, it was Y, so therefore you have decreased the water quality. And unfortunately, speaking of another long line of people that did not like this bill, every polluter or corporation you can think of was lined up against this bill, despite it being, in my opinion, very common sense. So this is just to give you a sense of just the scope and sort of level at which Bob and I are operating. So we're working on our major bills and everything, but we're also keeping tabs on climate resilience and comprehensive plans. We're working on wildlife, we're doing transit, we're doing land preservation, we're doing trees, we're doing plastics, we're doing drinking water, we're doing water quality, all at the same time. And it's all happening pretty much what feels like on the same day sometimes. So Bob, any other thoughts on this slide?
Just one, and that is that in these committees that Connor is really talking about us attending and speaking on behalf of these bills, that is where you really see the politics at work, because essentially the Republicans in the House would just take turns shooting down each bill. It was clearly choreographed in many of these committees that I was in, where it'd be Delegate Ware would knock this one down, Delegate Weber would take his turn, Delegate Marshall would take his turn, and the statement that they would make was clearly pre-packaged because it made no sense versus the testimony that was just given. But it was just, well, we just don't think that we're quite ready for this bill, or this bill's just not quite baked yet, or whatever. It's just generic, nonsensical language. And it was fascinating and in a really disheartening way to see that unfold time after time in these House subcommittees in particular. So if you didn't think that was going on, now you do.
Yeah, that's the part they don't show on TV.
Yeah.
I want to pass it over to Bob to touch briefly on another project. Speaking of projects, Bob and I love taking on projects, things that we are working on. This is a pretty important one, Bob.
Yeah, this is a multi-year effort that Sierra Club and quite a broad coalition, actually, including Climate Action Alliance of the Valley, have been involved in the past 2 or 3 years. We know that, Connor talked about transportation being a big source of carbon emissions. We know that buildings are 20 to 30% of carbon emissions as well. And the best way to address that is to have better construction codes. But just as Connor described, all the industry lobbyists that oppose us on things around pollution and energy, here the rogues gallery includes the home builders, the gas companies, gas meaning natural gas, the realtors. These are the folks that line up and try to torpedo any bill that will lead Virginia to higher quality building efficiency codes. So Senator Boysko and Delegate Corey, both of whom helped us last year as well and pass a fairly modest bill in the 2021 session around forcing the Board of Housing and Community Development, which is the agency that governs these things, to at least weigh the long-term benefits of improving building codes. So that was a small victory. This would have taken one step further, which would have said if any locality wants to go beyond the statewide building codes that Virginia has, and these are updated every 3 years, that they could by selecting another well-known construction code that you see here, in a National Green Construction Code, as in its stead. Very simple, actually, but still very threatening to all those industries that I mentioned. And their argument essentially is as follows. Well, this will increase the cost of new homes, and that will reduce the affordability of homes, which is bad for Virginians. And that's a compelling sounding argument to legislators who have about 30 seconds to consider each bill that they see come across their desk. Unfortunately, it's missing the more important part of the equation, which is that after you close on a house, you're in the house for many years. And over those years, you're saving sometimes quite significant amounts of money on your utility bills, to the point where some of the aspects of the code that we've been fighting most vociferously for, the insulation in walls, for example, and also the number of sort of the tightness of the building envelope, those are the two biggies. And if they would just follow this code instead of the weaker standards that they've implemented, those payback times are just 2 or 3 years. So these improvements will save people money, not cost people money. But again, that rebuttal to the home builders argument comes just too late for the ears of the legislators. They've already bought into the bogus argument. So we'll keep fighting. There is a regulatory process that's going on right now, as a matter of fact, to define this next 3-year statewide building code. And Sierra Club is in there, as is Climate Action Alliance as well, fighting the regulatory side of this as well. It is a constant fight because those lobbyists really dominate the process and essentially veto any improvements to these efficiency codes. So if you ever want to know more about this topic, feel free to give me a call or send me an email, because this has become, as Connor said, an ongoing project that we'll continue to fight for.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, emphasis on the ongoing as we continue to deal with this one. This is our problem slide. So we had about 3. Bob and I boiled it down to 3 bills pass this session that we opposed the final version of. And while we could spend probably 10 hours on this slide, just to give you an overview of these bills and where they went wrong. The first is Senate Bill 565 from Senator Surabel. It's a bill that purports to attempt to solve the problem of methane emissions, which we agree is a problem and we need to resolve. The bill allows natural gas companies to connect sources of methane emissions, so landfills, wastewater treatment plants, hog or other large agricultural farms, put a nice cover over top of it and capture the methane in there, and then put it in their pipeline and send it out. Then connect that pipeline to their main feeder pipeline and then put it into essentially regular natural gas pipelines. That sounds great if you're a natural gas company, because what it should sound like is cha-ching. They're going to get to charge their customers and earn a profit on all the things that I just described. And while this is sort of the cornerstone of our vigorous opposition, there is sort of, undefined science at the moment about whether what I just described is better or worse for the environment, all considered, than on-site sort of methane evaporation into the atmosphere. Only one problem is that the natural gas companies managed to convince the General Assembly that they did not need to have any specific methane emission target reductions in the bill. So this is the source of our vigorous opposition, which is essentially that they will build all of the infrastructure necessary to capture methane emissions from a landfill, for example. They will put that charge on their customer's bill, that all the infrastructure, millions of dollars it's going to take to do that, spread out across the customer base. And then in the end, after we all paid millions of dollars and they connected all these lines together, none of us on this call, none of us in Virginia are guaranteed to see any methane emission reduction at all. So the bill had a lot of problems. We tried. We attempted to negotiate. We sent several counter offers back and forth to the senator through the senator's office that were just rejected out of hand. Sort of became an untenable process. And so we opposed the outcome here, which is unfortunate because it's an issue that needs to be addressed, but the gas industry giveaway was not the answer. And the second bill was Senate Bill 657 from Senator Stewart, which is a bill that repeals the authority of the state air and water boards to issue or deny permits and gives that authority to the Department of Environmental Quality. And, you know, we could spend all day on it, but essentially it's industry retaliation at its best, its finest. The industry was mad that the Air Pollution Control Board denied the compressor station permit for the Mountain Valley Pipeline in Chatham, even though that the Air Pollution Control Board was right in their decision, not only by state law, but by the ruling in the Fourth Circuit from a previous compressor station case. But nevertheless, the industry was able to convince legislators that these decisions were being made by rogue activists, even though they are statutorily required to meet certain qualifications to serve in the role. And we talked earlier about how our Senate was weak, and we were joking about counting up our votes on the Andrew Wheeler nomination. Well, here is where we weren't able to count the votes, and the Senate was really weak on this issue, and they bought hook, line, and sinker into the industry's argument that these decisions needed to be made by DEQ. And if you think about it on the surface, that might sound okay, but unfortunately for the career employees at DEQ, which happens at every level of government, they're not always able to get the truth out because they communicate through their superiors, and their superiors are elected, and then their superiors are appointed. So this was a really big problem and a really unfortunate bill. We were able to save the public comment and public participation portions of the Water and Air Board's authority, which is important for building a public record should any other actions that might involve a lawyer need to be taken down the road. And then I'm going to let Bob quickly explain the last bill that we opposed.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. And those first two are definitely the lowlights of this session. They are the black eyes, and I think that you know, as it comes time to hold our elected representatives accountable, these will be two bills that will play into that accountability quite a bit, because there's no excuse for a vote for either of those bills. The House bill at the bottom here from Delegate Weber was one that we were very concerned about early on. And it was interesting because the environmental community was kind of split on this one. So why would that be? Well, I think the intent was to do something that Connor and I actually agree is important to do, which is balance the need to roll out solar in a big way in Virginia with land use needs and all the other kinds of things that are important around land, agricultural use, forests. We want to keep our forests, historical importance, all these things that you've seen play out county by county across Virginia in local siting debates. And what we've also seen is that many of these counties have decided to deny requests to put up a solar farm in their county, and that's not a good situation to play out. We are behind in Virginia in the amount of solar that we're building out, and so we were very concerned that this bill, which says, hey, if you're building on prime agricultural land or forested land, there are additional mitigation requirements we're going to put upon you. And so we argue back and forth, and I won't spend any more time on this, but the good news is that we were able to get a couple of changes to the bill that made us somewhat more comfortable with it. One, projects that are in process by December of 2024, so that's more than 2 years from now. Any projects that can be entered into the process by then will be exempt from these new requirements. That was very important to the industry to avoid kind of bringing them to their knees. And the other piece was that there will be an advisory board that determines specifically what kind of mitigations are required for projects on this kind of land. Because if you and I can think of mitigation strategies that should be relatively straightforward for an installer to employ, we can also probably come up with mitigation requirements that are almost impossible for these companies to comply with. So the devil will be in the details. We do have folks from industry and from the environmental community that are in this advisory board. So I have hope for this one, that it may not turn out as bad as it looked at the beginning, but we will keep an eye on it.
Thanks, Bob. I am going to scoot down to top lines that we, Bob and I, have sort of come up with as best ways to describe our experience. The first one, which you kind of got a sense of just now, was the only way to pass a bill this session was to have some sort of consensus among the people that the legislators were hearing from. Legislators are human, and they don't necessarily want to have to pick in difficult fights. They would rather that everyone tell them everything's okay, they get to hit the button, go home happy. They actually very much don't like when there's opposition to bills, because then it forces them into making a decision. The second thing is bicameral communication. So we talked a little bit earlier about the political dynamics, but it became increasingly clear that if the Senate wasn't on the same page as a House bill, it was going down. And if the House wasn't on the same page as a Senate bill, it was going down. And so the Senate and the House needed to be on the same page. And number three is lawmaker education, which I think this is going to be an interesting part that Bob and I sort of take with us over the next 6 to 8 months, which is these folks don't have a lot of expertise. They may have expertise in one area. They may be a nurse, a lawyer, a teacher, or something. They may have experience in that area, but come to them about, a House Bill 206 on solar siting issues and farmland mitigation. They're going to just kind of stare at you and wonder why you haven't fixed it. And it goes right back to number one, which is they don't want to deal with the issue because they're confused. They don't understand what you're talking about, and it's difficult. And to some extent, that's true. We have a part-time citizen legislature. Number four is any bills that anyone was hoping to make a TV ad out of, Bob and I joked, were defeated. You're not going to get your TV ad bill through for the next campaign. And number five is the committee strategy. So we talked a little bit earlier about how in the Senate Agriculture Committee, which somehow is where we always end up with our bills, is 8 Democrats to 7 Republicans. So one person goes the other way on either side and a bill can pass or fail. And so counting them up and getting everything ready was really important. And then the last thing is becoming more true by the day. Virginia politics affected by national political trends. There used to be a time where the state legislature kind of almost operated independently from Washington's mess. And I think that is becoming less true by the day. And we are being hit with sort of the dysfunction that's occurring in Washington at the state level, whereas, we hadn't before. So, Bob, any thoughts on our top lines?
No, I think that's right. And I will just highlight number 1 and 3. So the slide that we kind of skipped over talked about how you really need to get to these busy legislators early, before the session even starts on key items. A, for the education that we talked about here, number 3, and B, to head off issues that Connor talked about in number 1, which is who might oppose it? What are the legislators' concerns? You'd be surprised maybe how readily those will come to mind in those preliminary conversations. And they might not be the things that you knew were going to be a problem. So very, very valuable. And as just you all who aren't doing lobbying full time, but if you do decide to take any kind of action or get involved in any way with legislation, keep that in your mind that, hey, you know what, if I have an issue that I'm particularly interested in, maybe I will give them a call this summer or in the fall, assuming it's not an election year. They actually listen, and they're actually happy to talk to you. It's much easier for them to talk to you in those off oftentimes than during session, where it's just become very obvious the past few years, any time that they had to engage with constituents or us, it's just seemingly evaporated. So that would be my only sort of word to the wise there.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. I just want to touch, this is our last slide on sort of what comes next, but what comes next sort of happening. So today, earlier today, actually, there was a special session of the General Assembly. It was very exciting. It was 71 whole minutes long. And they came to no deal and went home. So, you know, it must be nice, but it's going to take some time because there's still no state budget. They've got to sort out the budget. They are currently in the trading barbs phase of the budget negotiations. So they are throwing things at each other and seeing if anything sticks. And so hopefully that transition to, in my experience, which is the next phase, which they actually sit down and talk to each other, trying to figure out a deal. This happens every time there's a split legislature. So every time one chamber is controlled by the other party, they are never able to come to an agreement. There's always a special session. So that's what we faced earlier today, where they all came to Richmond, sat in their seats, got mad at each other, and then went home. So we will see what comes of that in the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, the chapter, Bob and I will start planning for future. We'll start planning for our conservation campaigns and other grassroots organizing that we need to get underway. And Bob mentioned that one bill on solar siting has a stakeholder group. It's not the only one that does. There are many. So we will begin some agency and administrative work to track sort of stakeholder work groups, agency actions, how they're implementing the legislation that passed, and all of that as well. So with that, say thank you and be glad to take any questions. I'm going to turn my screen share off.
Hey, thank you. And I have in the security settings restored the ability for folks to unmute themselves if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, or if you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can go ahead and toss something in the chat as well. I had a question myself here for with the fleet vehicle fleet optimization bill that you guys worked on. A couple of questions. One, like from the practical side of it, we're thinking about like a state agency and the procurement process. And I imagine there's still going to be wiggle room, for example, for someone to say, you know, I have a specific use and I need to justify X, Y, and Z purchase, but this is going to become maybe more important for sort of big fleet purchases when you're talking about buying, you know, replace 30, 40 vehicles at a time or something along those lines.
Yep, absolutely. One of the things that we had to do to get the bill passed was to institute an exemptions section. You know, a government agency will they'll have to send a report basically and say, you know, we're requesting exemption for this reason. You know, it's not going to be often, we don't think. Otherwise, we'll have to come back and fix this. But you know, for instance, right now, like we can imagine VDOT saying, we can't find an electric dump truck, right? We need a dump truck and we can't find one. And so things like that, there's some wiggle there. But for the most part, we think that they're going to have a tough time getting themselves out of doing it this way.
And sort of on the flip side of that, I was wondering if there was discussions when you guys were sort of thinking through that and how you're writing it up about sort of the ability for something like that to trickle into other things long term, right? So as like agencies start making these kinds of decisions to purchase electric vehicles, they start thinking on their own, why aren't we, you know, thinking about solar ready roofs and all these other efficiencies that come with electrification?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, before we started this process before the election last year, and we had a little more hope, I think, for you know, our solar roofs bill and others that sort of go down that line with, particularly at the end of the Northam administration, they were signaling a decent willingness to go a pretty long way in some of the things that we were asking for, that we were hoping would continue, but just didn't. And so I think that those things are ongoing at state agencies. I think, unfortunately, those ideas are not going to rise to the top under their current leadership. Whereas if they had different leadership, they may be able to bring those ideas forward a little more aggressively if there was going to be support for them once it reached the top. But like I said, it's kind of hard for the career state employees to take action on something that's not going to get support.
Yeah, I think the way to get anything like that passed is the economic argument. And I can imagine that sort of argument on the solar roofs. In fact, I'm surprised it didn't carry some weight even this session, because we're talking about saving taxpayer dollars here. We're not pushing that. Well, we may be pushing this because of environmental concerns, but the argument is that we try to make, and we've known this for years now. It really, even with a lot of Democrats, it's really an economic argument that that carries the weight, and it makes it much more difficult to argue against if you're trying to, help school systems save money. I mean, what's the argument against that? So we need to try again, but I agree with Jonathan. I think that this type of approach that was successful with the fleet optimization is a clue for us going forward to other kinds of ways that we can move things along.
Kathy?
Yes, first, I really want to thank both of you so much for your passion, your skill, and your perseverance. You know, you've got all three, and it's just tremendous to hear your presentation. And I'm so glad it's being recorded. My question is, you're suggesting talking to our legislators, and open chain is pretty unreachable, but with Tony Wilt, if we were to talk to him about an issue, thinking about him and about the issues that you want to push, what would you suggest we focus on?
Great question. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Bob.
I'll field that one, because I have not even tried to talk to Obenshain because he is impossible, but I have spoken to Wilt many times. And even though he's very tough and he's going to vote against us the vast majority of the time, he will listen. And if you can find an approach that appeals to him, you can sometimes cut through it. And so what's important to him? His faith is very important to him. You can make an argument around taking care of creation. Economics are important to everybody. So if you can kind of phrase it, especially in his district, hey, we can save money for the school systems or for taxpayers. Those are the sorts of things that I've tried with him. And jobs too. I mean, there is some budding solar activity in that district, and it creates jobs, and it creates tax revenue as well for the larger solar farms. So I've had a little bit of success with him on that, and that would be my suggestion.
Any specific issue, like the bills, like the building code? I'm wondering about that. I mean, that's a big push, I know. So do you think that he has any hope in that area, or should we focus on another area?
He might. I would be willing to spend the energy on that. The problem with the House is that we really spent most of our energy on the Senate this session, because the House was it was a lost cause. I mean, we just couldn't get anything through it, and we knew that. So Wilt is more important when there's a chance to actually get something through. But I would love to have him, be supportive. If you could get him to be supportive enough on a bill like that to actually co-patron it, then you're really talking. And I don't know if he would be. It's not really in his wheelhouse, but I think that if you kind of walk through, hey, people are having a hard time, and my testimony to the committee, this is what I tried to say. Folks are having a hard time paying their utility bills. The better standards will help them pay their utility bills and save money. I mean, it's a savings play, not an additional cost. I mean, there is some additional cost up front, but it is dwarfed by the savings. And if you could somehow get through that argument with him, I think he might be supportive. I don't really think he's in the pocket of some of these lobbyists. They all listen to him, right? Because they're in front of him every day. But I think he really does want to do the right thing most of the time. So I think it's worth a try.
And then he might be able to say something to Open Chain. I don't know.
It's possible. I think are they in the same, are their offices adjacent there? I think?
Yes, they are. They share office space.
Yeah. So he might, I mean, if he was going to patron something, I'll bet you he would. But again, first things first, see if you can kind of get him to be supportive. We did a little bit with solar, so it's possible.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think Wilt is a very thoughtful person, even though he doesn't always vote our way in the end. I do think that, unlike many other legislators, that he does actually think through a lot of these things. And it's always good to just have even if it's just a cordial introductory meeting, just to build a relationship with him. That can sometimes even be more important than any policy argument that you bring forward. Because sometimes these folks get yelled at a lot. And they don't really want to be yelled at. Sometimes once in a while, a nice meeting, they're like, hey, well, that was great. Sure. What do you want me to do?
100%. 100%. You know why?
Well, we've met with them for years. Cav has, and I've baked home-baked gingerbread cookies and bread and taken it, and so it's gotten to be a joke, right?
No, but that's the way to go, because
right.
Maybe you never get together on the particular issue that you're trying to get to that day, but now you got a relationship, and that means that he is much more willing to listen to you next time, maybe on that same issue, but if not, maybe a different issue. It's you can't overstate the importance of building some kind of relationship with these folks.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're humans, and so I always give folks advice. I'm like, hey, they're humans. They don't want to be yelled at. Go in there and be nice, and then the person goes in and says, hey, they like me, and I'm like, well, great. For the next 6 months, you're going to be able to reach out, and they're going to answer your email, and that's a whole lot better of a path than some of the other alternatives. Well, thank you for spending some time with us this evening.
Yeah, thank you both so much for being here. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you both very much. I really appreciate y'all going through all of this with me, because I mean, especially the fleet optimization bit. I mean, because that feels like something that could be replicated on a local level in some way.
I'll just say that Kenneth, who goes by KC, is new to the Harrisonburg, and he just graduated from W&L Law School, practicing law here. So he's getting active, and it's great to have him on board.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Casey. Yeah, I would encourage everyone to be very politically active. Elections really, really matter. Take a look at what we just told you and compare it to what happened the prior 2 years. It's stark. And the reason for that, there's only one reason for that. It's what happened on election day in November of last year. So please do whatever you can. Some people do door knocking, other people contribute money, whatever you can do. That's an investment. That's an investment to get better results next time. I can't put it any plainer.
You're here. Yeah, well said. And yeah, a great place to end our evening together. Thank you so much again for joining us and providing this update, and we'll likely be sure to reach out next year.
All right, thanks you all.
See you
Have a good
later.
night.
Bye.